One way of making crime statistics go down is to classify fewer things as crimes or not to arrest people for crimes.
Do you get aroused by stimulating intellectual conversation? Are you turned on by the idea of engaging with thought leaders from across the United States? Do you go gaga over exploring important ideas from influential books, research, and essays? Then welcome to Curiosity Porn, the place you can satisfy all those intellectual urges guilt-free. Your hosts are Dr. Guy Crane, Professor of Philosophy at Rose State College, and Professor James Davenport, Professor of Political Science at Rose State College. However, the views expressed here are solely the views of the hosts and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. And now, here are James and Guy.
Hello, folks. It's Guy from the future here. Have you ever heard of Goodhart's Law? It's a law that says once a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. The idea is that there are things we might want to measure that really matter to us: crime rates, surgery outcomes, graduation rates, etc. And having that information really could inform us about the things we care about. But people can be incentivized to try to game the system, to get those measures to turn out a certain way for their own purposes. And as a result, those measures stop telling us what we really want to know. Maybe some of you have heard of the Cobra effect. The Cobra effect is based on an anecdote about snakes in India. The British government wanted to reduce the cobra population in India, and they started offering a certain amount of money to Indian citizens in exchange for dead cobras. It seemed to work at first, but then it had the opposite effect. Indians began breeding cobras in captivity just for the sake of collecting the money. It was actually more lucrative to do that than it was to go and find and kill cobras in the wild. Well, the Brits eventually got savvy that Indians were gaming the system, and so they stopped offering the bounty for the cobras. Well, you can probably see where this is going. When they stopped offering the bounties for the cobras, Indians who had been breeding the snakes simply dumped their captive cobras in the streets. And of course, the situation was way worse than what they started with. Or maybe some of you have heard of the Rooney Rule. It's a rule that the NFL uses to try to increase diversity within the organization. So according to the rule, for any general manager or head coaching position, NFL clubs must conduct in-person interviews with at least 2 external diverse candidates, diverse as in either a member of a minority group or a female. Now, if you want to show that you value diversity, that sounds like a good rule. The banking giant Wells Fargo has boasted about its commitment to diversity by having a very similar rule that it follows in its hiring practices. Turns out, though, Wells Fargo employees quickly learned how to game the system. Some hiring managers already knew the candidates they wanted to hire, many of which were internal and not diverse, and they would simply conduct token interviews with external diverse candidates merely for the sake of following the rule, but with zero intention of actually hiring those external diverse candidates. What's going on here? Well, our guest today thinks this is what happens when we have an unhealthy relationship with measuring things. There's nothing wrong with measuring things. In fact, it can be a very good thing. But bad things happen when we expect our various measures and metrics to do more than they're really supposed to do. Today's episode will be part 2 of our interview with Dr. Jerry Muller, a historian at the Catholic University of America in D.C. Muller has written a fantastic book called The Tyranny of Metrics. James and I highly recommend this book. It is so applicable to just about any workplace environment, so you should definitely check it out. But for now, please enjoy our discussion with Dr. Muller about the tyranny of metrics. Well, all right. Why don't we shift now to part 2 of our discussion and talk about your book, The Tyranny of Metrics. You've written not just this book, you have tons of articles about this topic of metrics. ways in which the performance of employees or institutions are measured, especially anything that's quantifiable, right? You actually think this can be a valuable thing. And I do want to come back to that later. But for right now, I want to focus on your critical case. The problem isn't with metrics, you say, but with what you call metric fixation. Can you explain for our listeners what exactly is metric fixation?
Okay. Metric fixation is the belief that institutions are run most effectively when they are based on standard measurements that are standardized in such a way that marginalizes or eliminates the role of subjective judgment and experience in judging employees, judging physicians, judging schools, and so on. So first of all, it's based on the belief in the value of standardized measurement. Secondly, and this is very important, it's based on the premise that individuals and institutions should be rewarded or punished based on those standardized measurements. And thirdly, it's the belief that institutions run best when those quantifiable metrics are made transparent, that is, are made public in some way or another. So it's, again, standardized measurement at the expense of judgment. It's reward and punishment on the basis of those standardized measures, and this belief that numbers are most reliable and ought to be made transparent. That's what I mean by metric fixation.
What's interesting about that is that on the surface, like if you just use the term in common parlance and said like, well, I'm really fixated on metrics, it sounds like, like suggests that they're just looking for data. Like, listen, I just want evidence that will lead me to evidence-based conclusions. But you write as though in some cases it's just the opposite is true. I want to read a quote from your book that I found really provocative. You write, metric fixation has elements of a cult. Studies that demonstrate its lack of effectiveness are either ignored or met with the assertion that what is needed is more data and better measurement. Metric fixation, which aspires to imitate science, too often resembles faith. Why do you think that is? Why does metric fixation maintain a cult-like following or a faith-like devotion, despite evidence of its shortcomings?
Well, there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, there's what Hayek critiqued as pseudoscientism. That is the belief that everything should, or that all systems of evaluation should imitate those of physics or the physical sciences. And that goes together with a faith in numbers. So if you have numbers are considered to be more reliable than judgments or decisions that are based on something other than numbers or numbers combined with something else. So one is a kind of spillover effect of belief in science and belief that it can then be applied, sort of those methods can be applied directly in the human realm. Secondly, there are lots of people who have a material interest in this focus on metrics. People who are consultants, for example, or people who have gone to business school. One of the main assumptions of consultants in business schools is that business and organizations, running organizations, are a matter of techniques. And those techniques can be taught either in business school or can be taught to you by your consultant. And they can be applied from one business to another in one realm or to another as well, without real immersion in the concrete details of the particular organization or enterprise. So people whose skills are in metrics tend to have a self-interest in believing that the more those metric methods are applied, the better off we'll all be. Though, in fact, maybe the better off they'll be, but not the rest of us.
Well, let's talk about a couple of examples that kind of struck both of us as highly salient in your book. Now, you had literally dozens of examples like this, but the two that stood out were doctors in New York who started getting report cards on their surgery-related mortality rates, and then policing in Chicago and London, where they were attempting to, I guess, lower crime rates and increase arrest rates, right? And we are confident, Guy and I were discussing, we're sure that deploying metrics in these situations certainly made everybody better off and achieved the outcomes desired, correct?
Yeah, that's what they thought and claimed. So let's deal first with the surgeons. So surgeons, I think first in New York State, and then it spread to other states as well, and now it's widespread. In the interests of metrics and transparency, states began to publish these surgical report cards, which indicated for each surgeon the mortality rate of the operations that they performed, of particular kinds of operations, like heart operations, for example. And the notion was that they would make these public, they would make these metrics transparent, and then people would see who are the better surgeons, who are the worst surgeons, and they would go towards the better surgeons and stay away from the worst surgeons. So the surgeons figured out very quickly that it was very much to their advantage to have a low mortality rate show up in these metrics, and very much to their disadvantage to have a higher mortality rate show up. And they figured out rather quickly, too, that the best way of making sure that you had a low mortality rate in your surgeries was to avoid patients who were more likely to die. And who was more likely to die? Patients with more serious levels of disease, and patients with more comorbidities. So surgeons then started to avoid operating on those riskier patients. And those riskier patients had then two choices, so to speak, or two possibilities. One was to go to some other hospital in some other state, which some did. Another possibility, of course, was to die because nobody would operate on you, right? But the death of those patients who were not operated on because they were riskier, that didn't show up in the metrics. At least it didn't show up in the metrics of the surgeons in question. And so that process of what we sometimes call cherry picking or avoiding the riskier cases so as to improve your metrics, that's a rather ubiquitous form of manipulating the metrics or responding to the metrics. In terms of crime statistics, and I think actually this is very relevant, it's relevant in many times and places, but it's very relevant now in many times and places in the United States. One way of making crime statistics go down is to classify fewer things as crimes or not to arrest people for crimes. So to take a recent example in San Francisco under progressive prosecutors and also in other places, they decided that they wouldn't arrest people for theft under $1,000. Well, their crime rate of theft went down. The statistics, the metrics went down, that is to say. But the reality didn't. And it can work the other way too. If you're looking to increase, let's say a politician says to the chief of police, we need to increase the arrest rate. Policemen can do that by simply arresting more people for more minor crimes. And so that's another form of some of the perverse effects of metric fixation.
Yeah, you argue that metric fixation, it's prevalent in the business world, but it's ultimately bad for business. Especially in the sense of developing the kinds of employees that businesses should want, right? That they're going to most benefit from. I'd love for you to unpack that. And maybe you could start by unpacking another quote from your book. You write, "The calculative is the enemy of the imaginative." What were you going for there? And in what ways is metric fixation bad for business?
Right. So, of course, businesses do need to measure things. They need to measure their costs. They need to measure their profits. They need to measure their productivity per machine, their productivity per employee, and so on. So again, we can come back to this, but I'm not against measurement. But if you're going to reward employees by a system of metric fixation, where you're going to evaluate them and reward them on the basis of standardized measures, then you're going to be measuring certain standardized things. You're going to be measuring some system or some output that you've determined in advance, right? And you're going to reward or punish the employee depending upon how to what degree they reach or exceed that output. Now that's fine for certain standardized tasks, like the rate of replacing car windshields, for example, or something like that. And there are many such repetitive tasks in a capitalist economy that don't require thinking outside the box or thinking anew or whatever. But for those sorts of tasks that do require thinking more broadly or trying to come up with new and better ways of doing things, those are things that can't be measured by standardized measurements. In other words, if you want somebody who's just going to do the same thing over and over, and you're going to measure whether he does it a bit better or a bit worse, that's one thing. But if you want the kind of employee that's going to think about, maybe there's a better way of doing this, or maybe the system that we have for producing X can also be used for producing Y. In that sense, if you value imagination, thinking outside of the routine and the repetitive, then metric fixation is going to mitigate against those kinds of employees. And that's true, by the way, in terms of the world of finance too. And that's why, for example, venture capitalism is, or angel capital or angel finance is quite interesting, because to some degree it's made up of people who are willing to think more imaginatively, who are willing to think outside the box, who are willing to take greater risks, as opposed to more typical financial institutions that, look at the revenue of a particular property or a particular corporation year after year and make their investments on that basis, instead of thinking about is there some new possibility that's arising here that involves greater risk but potentially has much greater rewards. So that's what I meant by the calculative is the enemy of the imaginative.
Nice. I've been through your book now twice, and this time particularly, it reminded me of the work of one of my favorite current philosophers, a philosopher by the name of T. Wynn. He is a professor at the University of Utah. He has a paper that's called How Twitter Gamifies Communication. He argues that by way of things like retweets and likes, we have these richer values and goals that we care about when we engage in communication and knowledge seeking, but those values can get captured and even instrumentalized for the sake of achieving shallower, quantifiable ends. Like, I'm not just trying to learn now. I'm just trying to get retweets. I'm not trying to know things. I'm just trying to get likes. Your book largely focuses on workplace-based tyranny of metrics, but after being reminded of Wynn's work, I was wondering, do you see forms of metric fixation in private or consumer life as well?
Yeah, very much. So, for example, in terms of along the lines that you were talking about, in terms of the internet, the whole clickbait culture of producing forms of entertainment or forms of information or pseudo information that are put on the internet in sensationalist forms to get you to click upon them, and where the producers are often rewarded based on the number of clicks. That's been going on now for a number of years in the internet and in newspapers that increasingly depend upon clicks from the internet and so on. And it does tend to lead to a degradation in terms of the quality of information and greater degree of sensationalism and so on. Similarly, on the internet, you have this interesting and, to me, very troubling phenomenon of audience capture, where you have some intellectual or commentator or writer who puts out certain ideas and then finds that some of them have more of an audience among a particular kind of person. A person may be more and more to the right, or more and more to the left, or more and more religious, or more and more anti-religious, or whatever. And they increasingly then alter the emphasis of what they're saying. They alter their message to cater to that audience that has clicked more on those sorts of themes that have that kind of appeal. And there are a number of cases, I can enumerate them if you want, of rather interesting intellectuals or commentators whose views have really been perverted, I would say, by this process of audience capture, being captured by the clickability of their own audience, as it were. And I think that's another consequence of a kind of metric fixation. And it can manifest itself in other ways too. Places like Yelp or Amazon reviews and so on. These can also often be manipulated in such a way as to get more and more positive reviews and to eliminate negative reviews so that the end result is actually somewhat distorted.
All right. I can't resist. I mean, this is called our podcast is about curiosity. If you want to go ahead and mention any examples of people who have fallen prey to this.
Sure. Let me give you two. James Lindsay, some years ago, wrote together with a fellow author, Helen Primrose, wrote a reasonably good book about wokeness and so on. In the process of audience capture, he's gone further and further in directions of thinking that everybody on the left is a communist, or thinking that, or delving into more and more conspiratorial conceptions of what's going on in the world. Or to take another example, Jordan Peterson, a non-religious, sort of moderately conservative thinker at the time of his first book, found that his audience was more and more to the right and more religious, and has been moving ever further in that direction, both in terms of the content of his thought and in terms of the radicality of his rhetoric, if you follow him on Twitter. So those are just two examples. There are examples on the left and in other directions as well, but those are two of the more better known ones.
I think that Peterson one is a really, really interesting, but we could go down that rabbit hole for a whole long time, and let's save that for another day. But that is a really interesting example. But it seems to me that what we're seeing here, the theme here is that the fixation on metrics is the problem, not necessarily the idea of using metrics themselves. And in fact, you make clear in your book, you're not telling businesses or other institutions to completely scrap metrics, but to use them wisely, to use them appropriately, I think would be the way to talk about that. Can you give us some examples of when metrics can or should be used and how they can prove especially helpful or useful in trying to solve a problem?
Yeah. So some of that has to do with who formulates the metrics and how they're formulated. Because one of the temptations of metrics is to focus on that which is most easily measured as opposed to that which is most important or significant. And so if the people involved in the field are involved in formulating the metrics, they can help decide which things are worth measuring in a standardized way, and can help keep in mind what sorts of things the standardized measures don't capture that need to be supplemented with judgment based on experience in thinking about rewarding individuals and rewarding institutions. And then there's the question of who the metrics are made available to. So it's one thing to take the mortality rates of surgeons and make them available in a public report card. It's something quite different to take, for example, 2 operating rooms in 2 hospitals in the same area and measure their mortality rates, and then have the participants in those operating rooms, that is the doctors and nurses and so on, look at the comparative metrics and see which operating room is doing better. And then they can consult the operating room the people in the operating room that's doing less well can consult with the people in the operating room that's doing better and see what they're doing differently that might then be adapted to the worst performing operating room. That's true in all sorts of educational settings and many other kinds of settings too. So it's a question of who formulates the metrics, who those metrics are made available to what degree the people judging the metrics have a sense of what the metrics aren't measuring or can't measure. And then there's another thing. If you have standardized metrics in place for a while, people will learn how to game them. That is, they'll learn how to get good metrics in a way that may be at odds with the purposes of the institution. And so you need to change the metrics or refresh the metrics from time to time. Those are all ways in which metrics can and should be used positively.
What you're saying right now reminds me, well, let me see if I can just summarize what you said and you say if I've got it. It sounds like what you're saying is that metrics are excellent granted, they need to be produced by people who actually know what is worth measuring. I'm getting you there. But it sounds like what you're saying is that they work great as diagnostic tools, but not as sticks and carrots, number one. And number two, especially not as goals, ends in themselves. I'm thinking about how what you're describing, you basically describe sort of a science experiment, right? Where you've got an experimental group and a control group, and you're trying to see what the measurable difference is. But I'm also thinking about how, like, even in science, maybe you're familiar with the concept of like p-hacking, right? Where like scientists want to get a certain kind of p-value. For our listeners' sake, p-values are scientists trying to calculate the probability that they would have gotten the results that they've got, like on accident, by sheer chance. And basically, to do good science in the sense of getting your paper published, you want that p-value to be below a certain value. And what you find out is that there are researchers out there that as soon as they realize that, like, to get my paper into a journal, I need to have a p-value below 0.05, they engage in all sorts of manipulations of their data set to try to see if they could ask a completely different question and get their numbers where they like it. Am I capturing what you're after? Is that a good parallel there?
Yeah. P-hacking is something I don't know about from personal experience. I just know about it from reading about it from its critics. But yes, that goes on all the time, apparently, in many social scientific disciplines. Is you just keep manipulating the data, trying to come up with, as you say, a certain p-value in a way that really doesn't add to the positive store of human knowledge. So that's a kind of particular disciplinary effect of, or disciplinary example of a kind of metric fixation too.
Well, nice. Okay. Well, this book, you wrote it a while ago. I mean, it's a few years in the rearview mirror now. I'm wondering how things look to you in hindsight. Metric fixation, is it better, worse, the same, different? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, that's certainly been the book of mine that has the greatest resonance. I mean, it's been translated into 10 or 11 languages, and I get citations of it every day. So it's widely cited, but how much influence it's actually had is difficult to determine. My sense is that the forces that lead people towards a fixation, that lead organizations towards a focus on metrics, are so great that there's the deluge of metric fixation has largely continued. Now, sometimes I do have people say, I bought this book from my boss or whatever, and sometimes there are leading people in government and in organizations that will read it and try to incorporate it. But it's a continuing uphill battle. And I certainly wouldn't say that the publication of my book has turned the tide. Wish it had, but it hasn't.
Well, we sure appreciate your visiting with us today, and trust me, we are big advocates of both of your books and try to share them wherever appropriate as well.
Before you get to that question, I do want to point out for our listeners, the book does have excellent examples of both tyranny metrics in higher ed and education for our listeners who are interested. It was very tempting on our part to want to focus on that, but we decided not to. So instead, we will leave that to those who want to buy your book and focus now on our final question we ask every guest.
Yes. So this is ongoing feud between Gaia and I, but here's the setup. So you're going to get off this show with us, and you have two options. Your options are, number one, you can go and watch an episode of Seinfeld, or number two, you can go and watch an episode of 30 Rock. Which of those would you choose?
The answer is an empirical one, because often at the end of the night, when I want to unwind, I do typically watch one or another of those, and the one that I've ended up watching most frequently and with the highest degree of satisfaction is Seinfeld. I don't know whose side I'm on in this regard, but I find a greater consistent degree of wit in that program than more or less any other comedy series that I've seen, even though I do enjoy 30 Rock as well.
All right.
I've got a big smile on my face. I think now Seinfeld is safely in the lead here. Guy will have to go back and do the calculations, but I think I can say that with some confidence.
I can admit it.
Well, our guest today has been Dr. Jerry Muller. We've been discussing his two books, The Mind in the Market and The Tyranny of Metrics. If you have not read them, both Guy and I highly recommend both books, and hope you'll go out and get yourself a copy, and they will enlarge your mind through that process. Dr. Muller, thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, gentlemen.
Thanks so much for being here.
And we will see you all next time.
Thanks for listening to Curiosity Porn with the two best intellectual pole dancers in the United States, Dr. Guy Crane and Professor James Davenport. If you'd like to share a comment about today's episode, suggest a guest or topic, or just leave a compliment or complaint, you can reach us at curprn@gmail.com. We hope to hear from you.